Hi, everyone. My name is Annika, and I am the Public Affairs Coordinator at the Digital Supercluster. And I'm pleased to welcome you to our final discovery workshop following our recent town hall. Before we get started, we respectfully acknowledge that in Canada, we live, work, and learn on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral land of Indigenous people. As myself and much of the Supercluster team are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, we are gathered here on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And we encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge and let us know in the chat the traditional territory that you are joining us from. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be distributed to all registrants afterwards. This is meant to be a very collaborative and interactive session. So if at any point you have a comment or a question, please feel free to raise your hand or type into the chat and we can get this discussion started. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Bill Tam.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely sunny day. Hopefully it's sunny where you are, wherever you might be. And we have about 15 folks, which is a perfect number for a conversation like this today. So I'm joined by Ian Evans, who's one of our investment leads for the Supercluster. And he and I are going to go through, I think, a workshop today to try to expand upon the conversations we had a little over a week and a half ago, where we did a virtual town hall and talked a little bit about some investment hypotheses that we might concentrate on phase two. And maybe just to set the stage, what I'm going to do is just share a screen and maybe go through a bit of a rewind on some of the things we talked about and just set us up for this conversation for today. So today's discovery session, we're talking about digital decarbonization. These are two words that you don't normally see together. So I appreciate that. There'll be lots of good input towards whether this is thematically well aligned with interests from you. And really, there's one primary objective that we have, which is to gather your perspectives and input towards our strategy as to where we might focus our investment efforts in phase two of our cluster efforts. Just as a bit of a reminder, our journey to date over the last 4.5 years, I guess we're into our 5th year now, has been about its digital innovations, specifically around accelerating the development and adoption of these digital innovations, and the focus being in the sectors of health and healthcare, sustainability, natural resources, in the industrial set and driving sort of transformation, and also in terms of digitally skilled workforce. So those have been our focus areas to date. And, in our phase one, it really kind of helped to prove out that the model could work. This new model of collaborative innovation, which was really at the core of it, about demand-driven R&D. So having a customer at the endpoint, have a customer sort of define what the problem sets that were needing to be solved, to accelerate the development efforts through this sort of collaboration, co-investment, de-risking, and bringing the right expertise and players around the table that no single organization on its own could have solved otherwise. And it's really about continuing to adapt this with the notion of having the customer voice and driving additional adoption characteristics beyond. And many of you are familiar with our collaboration model. There's industry partners that serve as customers. There's lead and supporting co-development partners. There's technical service providers that help to ensure that the solutions fit well within the framework of what customers are looking for in their operating environments. We involve post-secondary research organizations in every one of our technology leadership projects. And then, of course, we act as a co-investor in this whole scheme to ensure that we can help to fund some of the initiatives to drive further ambition and to create the necessary sort of glue that brings these groups together. And I think there's been quite a bit of success in our early investments into emerging areas of digital technologies here in Canada, where we either have or are building a global leadership position. Certainly in AI, machine learning, quantum computing, we're seeing it in genomics. There's been an awful lot of work in our projects around cybersecurity, privacy, and governance. We try to translate our capabilities around augmented virtual reality, immersive technologies in terms of how we visualize data. Of course, much of what's been done is around sensing, Internet of Things, 5G, smart devices, and then geospatial hyperspectral imaging, all part of the framework for better data collection and more robust data analytics. And then finally, in the areas of blockchain and decentralized technologies. And what we've seen is, great access to types of projects. So maybe what I'll do is I'll kind of go to where we ended last time, which was a starting point for our investment thesis. And we thought, well, number one, we've had some great success in health. And so we're going to continue to focus in those areas. We said in the talent and digital skills area, we're going to continue to focus in that area. But are there things that we might do to further refine our efforts in the natural resources, industrial, and sustainability spaces? And we did pick a couple of theses around there. One was around critical minerals, and it may expand to critical minerals and critical resources, and the area of digital decarbonization. And so digital decarbonization ultimately is, what are we doing in terms of applying digital innovations and technology to really affect sort of our collective goals around reducing emissions, around our net zero targets, and about at the same time kind of driving further productivity enhancements for some of those industry sectors. Just as background, I think many of you have probably had seen the writings in terms of the role that digital can play in sort of the quest for net zero. I think the World Economic Forum put out some studies that said, look, this can actually contribute up to 20% towards the reduction targets that we have for emissions. In Canada, this is the 2030 plan. You can see, there's across the major buckets, if you will, this is sort of what the plan is. Of course, all this plan is to get to net zero by 2050. But in the intervening sort of next 8 years or so, it's very clear that a large chunk of it in the gray areas you see at the top is really around transportation. We also will spend some time today talking about the yellow section in the middle called buildings. And we did have this notion that, and heavy industry, of course, being a big part of this as well. So the opportunities for digital decarbonization, this is part of what we talked about last time. And maybe this is a good segue, Ian, if you want to talk through these things, and then you can get into the workshop part of it.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. And hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So as Bill articulated, digital is often not the first thing that comes to people's minds when we talk about decarbonization. But when you think about how we actually scale solutions for a global population trying to increase the sustainability, digital becomes a really important vehicle for that scaling. So whether it's a companion technology that sits alongside built infrastructure, or whether it's increasing the reach and literacy of people trying to make better decisions, digital plays an important role. So, we've kind of zeroed in on these kind of three meta themes within our portfolio, partly driven by the membership that we have, partly driven by the opportunities we see for Canada, and partly driven by just an overwhelming request for projects in particular areas. So, the clean connected buildings really categorizes that a really high level of demand we have in our portfolio, but we've never actually invested in a project in around the decarbonization of our built infrastructure. Anyone who's lived through, the various generations of clean technology, energy savings and energy efficiency has always been a feature, of the narrative of smart cities and smart buildings. And actually, Canada has a pretty good reputation and momentum in around this technology set. So it's an area that we would like to do more in. It's an area where we believe, greater automation, greater insights, data-driven insights can actually lead to scalable solutions. So it's an area we would like to put, we would like to at least shine the spotlight and provide a sandbox for companies to come at us, a consortia to come at us with projects in that space. The second area obviously plays to Canada's role as a natural resource and commodity producer, and its role globally, and the challenges that the forestry industry and agriculture is facing as a result of climate change. Again, an area in which driven decision making and advanced planning has a really important role to play, where decisions that are made today will have impacts over potentially generations. So what we're looking for there is, technologies that help us better monitor and adapt to the impacts of climate change, better predict some of the cumulative effects associated with climate change, and improve planning and production in those environments. And then the third really is looking at some acute challenges that I'm sure many of you are aware of, the supply chain challenges that we've had kind of post-COVID, some of the challenges that wildfires and flooding has caused for not only trade in Canada, but globally. And digital technologies, we believe, have a role to play here, both in terms of coordinating intermodal transportation, doing advanced planning and simulation of various different events, trying to build resiliency in the systems that we have and alternative pathways if shocks are incurred, and to try and identify those bottlenecks that can be better alleviated through a data-driven approach. So these are really the three main core areas. We know there are many more, and we're really looking forward to digging into you telling us what we've missed and other considerations we might have as we build out this digital decarbonization program. But as a snapshot, Bill, that gives us a flavor.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we thought we'd open it up to the discussion today. Certainly one big theme are these the right areas for us to focus on? And I see we have some colleagues from Foresight, which is great, because then we can get sort of your perspectives to weigh in on this, because you've been obviously working in this area, and many of your companies have been working in this area for decades. And then, specifically, as we narrow that down, where are the opportunities for new digital innovations? And as important is, well, where is the industry driver for this? Not just, in terms of just early snapshots, but really to kind of leverage industry investments at scale. So maybe what I'll do is I'll take down the slideshow and see if there's any questions from the folks on this session right now, or any comments that you might have based on what you've seen so far. Okay, I know I've got a little bit of the post-lunch coma as well. So maybe what we'll do is we'll work our way into a little bit more of an interactive piece. Ian, maybe let's go to the workshop portion of this and see if we can get a few of our participants here to opine on what it is that we might want to start with.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Bill. So just looking through the list of people that we've got on the call here, I think we've got a good smattering of developers, a good smattering of people who are looking to support and advocate for organizations, lots of support around SMEs. Just for the names that I don't recognize, do we have any representatives from industries who maybe have ESG and decarbonization as a core part of their mandate for delivering on, and can maybe explain to us some of the initiatives that they're undertaking? If not, we can certainly dive into a more detailed view on what technologies are being brought to bear today, because I know there's lots of people on the call who can talk about their own tech. But is there anyone on the call who maybe can describe some of the initiatives that they're running in their organizations on decarbonization?
Well, maybe I can start if you want, Ian.
Please, Miguel.
And so one thing that we've been doing, we're doing two projects, mainly in the space domain. One is funded by the Canadian Space Agency, early stage funding, and the other one is by NASA and the International Space Station. What we're doing there is both projects, at least I'll talk a bit about the Canadian Space Agency project. It's about mapping greenhouse gases, CO2, CH4, CO, carbon monoxide, all that from hyperspectral satellite images. And we found out that there's a big gap where there are existing technologies that's doing this from satellites, but they measure a thing called top of the atmosphere greenhouse gases. And it's the way that we've been measuring carbon dioxide or the greenhouse gases at the surface level is by using surface sensors, and they're not really scalable. So we're trying to bridge the gap where we are predicting the carbon or the greenhouse gas level at surface using satellite hyperspectral data and deep learning. And on the other side with NASA, this is a self-funded project, but NASA selected us to send a payload to the space station. So we're building a little hyperspectral payload where the main goal is to get analysis-ready hyperspectral data within 15 minutes from space. So we're trying to combine those two. At some point in the future, we will combine those two. I'm just thinking, is that something that fits into this mandate, like digital decarbonization?
Yeah, I think environmental monitoring and GHG emissions is certainly one of the areas that we've thought a lot about. So, you know, we think of, you know, units of production and, you know, buildings are a unit of production where GHGs can be emitted. But also, you know, we do have everything from methane leak detection through soil carbon analysis, through forest carbon analysis. So certainly, you know, and I see we've got Chris and Matt from Earth Daily as well on the call who've done, you know, geospatial remote sensed, you know, projects in the past as well. And I'm sure have something to comment about this as well in the world of hyperspectral and geospatial analytics. But yeah, certainly that would fit within, you know, the things that we're interested in looking at. Maybe, Miguel, you could talk about some of the challenges as well in terms of, you know, hyperspectral is a certain class of technology, yes, and a certain class of data that often has to be blended with other sorts of data and other tools as well. You mentioned deep learning. You maybe just as a foil to maybe bringing in Chris and Matt into the conversation as well, just describe some of the challenges that you anticipate facing as you bring, you know, either the Canadian Space Agency project or the NASA project online.
Sure. Yeah, I think some of the technical challenges, at least what we are facing, is it's a sheer amount of data that gets collected and how to efficiently manage that. And we've definitely had a few conversations with Earthcast, Earth Daily too, to provide some of those services to manage that data. I think I'm getting into the territory where I'm just advertising Metaspectral right now, but which I don't really want to be the focus. But maybe I'm happy to join in as the conversation progresses.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Thanks, Miguel. Well, maybe Chris and Matt, you can comment on some of the challenges that you face in data wrangling. And again, you guys are very interested in the decarbonization and narrative as well, and what can be done. Certainly, we've been looking at projects of yours previously, and hope to look to some more in the future. But maybe Chris, you can articulate some of the challenges and opportunities you see.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. And nice to see you again. On our side, yeah, there's quite a few challenges with satellite imagery. Part of it is it's a complex type of data. So getting it into a form where it can be used for applications and being used for helping it for environmental challenges like decarbonization, there's often a lot of analysis and processing that goes in. So it ties in really well to what Nigel was saying in terms of, you know, there's a lot of data compression that you have to deal with. There's a lot of interpretation, and bring together different sources of data that include the satellites, but not just that, people's eyes on the ground, maybe IoT sensors, these different heterogeneous sources, and bring it together in a way that you can take that and solve real world problems is quite a challenging feat. And that's why bringing companies together in initiatives like the Supercluster are really good for that. We can bring in different skill sets to solve these really big picture problems. So at Earth Daily Analytics, we're in the process of building our satellites right now. And one of the big use cases is, of course, decarbonization. One of them is through methane monitoring, but also agricultural practices, regenerative agriculture, and as well as forestry protection, monitoring for illegal deforestation, and a few other things. Yeah, I think this is really relevant to the work at Metaspectral too. Again, I share Nigel's, I don't want to do too much Earth Daily advertising, but I did have one quick question. This is somewhat tangential to decarbonization, but I think related, and I'm curious to hear your and Bill's view if this relates. We are doing some work right now in phosphorus and nitrogen absorption using natural infrastructure. And the point of that is to minimize lake eutrophication, or to get rid of algae blooms in different lakes. Lake Winnipeg is one of the most heavily polluted lakes in the world, definitely one of the most in Canada. So we're looking at solutions for that. And we're starting that research now. But are these types of applications that aren't quite decarbonization, but still relate to environment, would they fall under this umbrella, or would you say that maybe outside of the current initiatives of the supercluster?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, Bill, maybe we should talk a little bit about the greening the economy platform and narrative. So, one of the new features of phase 2 of the supercluster program is a kind of a cross supercluster mission associated with greening the economy and building greater resilience in our supply chain. And so, whilst we, traditionally have thought of programs in a programmatic structure that I think in reality, where our projects actually lie, they often start with one particular outcome in mind and have multiple use cases that are built off it. Earth data store is a great example of that, where there's a core foundational body of work and applications that can run off it. I think the central narrative around digital decarbonization, obviously, what we're trying to do at a policy level is help contribute to the 2030 emissions reduction plan that Canada has. So that's a core part of our program, trying to understand the contributions that we can make there. But we understand those contributions can be diverse as well. And so trying to understand, where you have a core set of geospatial technologies that may have applications in around, the capturing and storage of carbon in forestry and regenerative agriculture practices, obviously is very interesting. But there may also be applications for the same set of technology in an analogous area where there's real commercial potential on a similar mandate. And I think that would be certainly could be part of the overall narrative. But as you know, Chris, trying to understand commercial traction and development and how we actually build those, irregardless of the use cases, is something we care very much about. And so I think it certainly could be built into it. But obviously, trying to understand how we play a meaningful role to contribute to the 2030 targets is central to the program.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, a great answer. And I think this provides a lot of clarity. And while I have you, just one more quick question, if you don't mind. Will the supercluster help connect government to the industry because I see the environment and decarbonization being in large part being supported by the government and government initiatives. And so connecting what we're doing within the industrial sector, is there a tie-in here through government, either federal or provincially?
Yeah, Bill, do you want to comment on that?
Maybe I'll cover that one. I think, Chris, that is, I think it's central to what we want to be able to do in phase 2. I think many of the folks that have been in projects in the first round probably found that level of participation was not as pronounced and certainly not as pervasive as we might otherwise. And so in this second phase, as Ian had mentioned, there are particular missions that the Government of Canada and priorities would like to pursue, which actually gives us much more of an integration point on, everything from, supply chain resiliency and what they're doing in Transport Canada to all the things that you mentioned, Chris, about Environment Canada, all the, various clean tech initiatives, either provincially or nationally, and a host of other things that deal with what we're going to do with the natural resources. So NRCan is a big part of that as well. And so what we're hoping in this next one, especially, some of the foundational pieces where you can bring not only expertise, but even data into the equation where there's a multiplicity of actors, that can be much more pronounced in this next round. One area we are trying to test for, though, in this kind of forum is to say, will we see sponsorship from kind of if government's in there, will we see more industry investments as a result of it? Obviously, if there was sort of a bit of a dangling carrot that says, hey, if we did this all together, maybe there could be some streamlining of policy levers, or maybe on the regulatory or the permitting side, or some of the things that deal with projects. And I think that's all the cacophony of opportunities we'd like to explore a little bit more. So I'll go back to Ian's original question. If anyone has any particular viewpoint from the standpoint of, well, where does industry want to invest, and what are the kind of opportunities that you guys are seeing from, kind of a broad stroke decarbonization, ESG, however you want to frame it, I'd love to hear some of that perspective. Thanks, Chris, for the question.
Yes, stunned food
Stunned
coma.
silence. I guess I asked a really tough question, no doubt.
Emily's just put into the chat, there's a big role for the provinces and territories in terms of natural resources, permitting, data provision, regulatory levers, etc. It'd be great to have great involvement in RAIN too. Yeah, we also talked about that in the critical minerals and resources section, and I think there could be meaningful overlap between both our critical resources narrative and digital decarbonization. I'm just wondering if there's anyone on the call here who could maybe, you saw our 3 pillars of, basically buildings, natural resources, trade and transportation. Is there anything, you feel like we've missed out? Like, why haven't we got this? Why aren't we looking at this particular sector? Why aren't we doing more, oil and gas, for instance? I'll throw that one out there as like, have we missed anything obvious?
I can jump in a little bit on that.
Hey.
I think Hillary Travis from Foresight. I think the 3 areas that you've chosen are definitely big areas of interest that in general, I'm hearing a lot of conversations happening. I think especially around decarbonization of supply chains, everybody's looking at that as the kind of next big piece of how do we figure that out, especially in shipping, especially in a place like Vancouver. How do we decarbonize the port? How does digital technology help us achieve that? Because, as we look at other kind of sources of energy, in such a logistical area, how do you actually ensure that that's being done right? So I think it's a great place to be looking at. A lot of other countries that I've had conversations with are also interested in this space. So I think it's good that this is a focus area for sure. And I think there's a lot of smaller companies also in BC and across the country who are starting to look into this area and see great opportunities. So from that, I think built environment is always, smart cities, people are always wanting to talk about that. And so I think having another group at the table to be able to work into that. I am a little bit more curious if you can give me a bit more background of why regenerative forestry and farming. I'm not completely aware of your background and what you guys have been doing in this space for the last little while. I know forestry was always talked about as the supercluster was being pulled together, but I'm curious why this is being focused in on.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. So yes, like the natural resource sector was always a key part of our phase 1 proposal, founding members of the supercluster. And we launched a project, in our first cohort, we had a project around forest machine connectivity. So some of the base challenges of digitization in a sector that traditionally has been challenged with digitization. So if you look at the sectors of the Canadian economy that are highly digitized, and those that are very poorly digitized, but huge contributors to our economy, natural resources in the forest sector and ag have tended to be nearer the bottom. So huge drivers of our economy, but very poorly digitized. And so, they've always been a core feature of ours as what if we could improve those sectors through digitization? Would we be able to achieve the productivity gains, the efficiency gains, the environmental stewardship gains that we all want to achieve, and use digitization as the means to that end? And I think that narrative still holds. These are still huge drivers of our national economy. There's still, innovation is bleeding into those sectors. There is a demand for them as pressures are increased on them, but also as some of the incentives and opportunities for them are presented as well. So, the emergence of things like TELUS Ag is a really interesting, move in that direction as people really think through the impact of digital technology in those sectors. So they remain really important sectors for us as the strategic parts of our economy, and they need digitization. And so at a very high level, that's why we're interested. We also have a thesis which states a large part of the Canadian economy has lots of understanding of those sectors as well, and bringing technology. We should be in an economy where we can bring those technologies to those parts of our industrial complex. So that embedded knowledge of how those systems work should be easier for Canadians than for other economies who perhaps are great at digital technology, but not in the implementation and adoption of that in those locations. So trying to provide an environment where natural resource companies, industrial consortia, SMEs, in some cases, large multinationals can actually collaborate and talk the same language. Canada is a bit of a unique place for that to actually happen for ag and for forestry. There are other jurisdictions that we compete with on that, but we do think Canada has an opportunity to be a leader in that space. So that's core to our narrative.
And in the
Well,
oh, sorry, go Bill.
No, please. If you had a follow-up question, Hillary, then I'll make a comment.
Yeah, and in the agriculture space, a really big challenge is actual implementation of these technologies and digitization, especially because farmers individually own their land and it's quite expensive for that. Whereas a forest sector example, they're a larger company that can implement these things. Have you guys thought about how you're going to approach that in choosing, regenerative ag?
Yeah, so I'll make a comment first of all on the selection exercise that it is far from perfect. That's why we're having these conversations to see if there are other areas that we should be considering. We have about a half a dozen sort of ag and food related projects in our portfolio right now, and some of them have the duality of both sort of how do you reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture, but it also represents an opportunity on sequestration, right? So there's sort of both the supply and the other side of it as well. The projects we've seen, the agricultural sort of the industry structure here in Canada is different than in other nations, and you got a lot of small sort of farm operators, maybe the same sort of capacity issues that we find writ large for SMEs in terms of their ability to adopt technology. So what we've seen in a few of our projects is the opportunity to work with large scale sort of manufacturing companies who embed this technology into it. For instance, I think most farmers will have John Deere equipment, or they'll have various sort of OEMs that will have some form of autonomy on their and maybe even sensing technologies built into theirs. So what can you do to kind of combine those data sets with other sort of ground truthing technologies, with other sort of geospatial, other sort of, maybe it's drone information, but ultimately I think in large scale, it's about actually making use of the data first, making sure that you've got good sort of repositories and ecosystems for collecting and amalgamating data, but then deriving sort of value out of that for the analytical frameworks. And it's not going to apply to everybody universally, but I do think that there are some demonstrable areas where there can be some, and this comes back to the question, where are the industry drivers for it? Who's going to pay for this stuff? Who's going to buy this stuff? And then maybe the buyer and the adopter aren't necessarily the same. So especially in the farming world, where more and more it's an integrated full stack solution that's provided to a farm, and some of the data exhaust that comes from that, it actually can be sold off in a different way or monetized in different manners. We are looking at how those business models might unfold. So it's a long answer to your question, Hillary, but I do think that there's ways to think about the model maybe a little bit differently.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it underscores this particular structural form that we have in the supercluster around consortia, and ensuring that we have an entire either supply chain or value chain actively engaged in the project, and ideally co-investing in the project together as a group, so that there's an actual vested interest from all parties to actually the outcome that we're seeking to achieve. I think there are a number of programs in Canada that exist for either just supporting an SME or an SME and a customer. And I think, there's been mixed results, as you said, Hillary, around this, which is, adoption is really difficult if you only have only one organization is really truly benefiting from investment and support. So as we try and bring an ecosystem around these projects, it's difficult to do. It takes time to curate these consortia, but we do find that it does provide a group with a singular vision to execute on, and the resources to actually achieve that. And that's always been central to the supercluster way of doing things. So thank you, Hillary, for the questions. Is there anyone else on the call that could flag maybe an area that we've missed or haven't thought about or talked about today as kind of obvious candidates for decarbonization strategy or intervention?
Robert asked a question about, was mining considered? Yeah, and sorry, Robert, why don't you come off mute and elaborate on the question?
Well, yeah, it was that was the question, Bill. I mean, it strikes me that within BC, we seem to be adopting a leadership role. If you look at the stuff Tech Resources doing, and mining is going to be a huge industry going into the future. Especially, with all the decarbonization strategies that we're going to have to implement. We're going to need raw materials, new ones, in order to be able to do that. And I just wondered if you folks were thinking through mining as an area for focus.
Very much, Robert. So we actually gave it its own lane around critical minerals and resources, which was a workshop we did last week.
Right.
And that's why today is like everything else, if you will,
Okay.
that's not mining.
Right. That's good to know.
Okay. And we've seen a number of projects. Yeah, it's very robust in our field, and
yeah,
we're geographically well aligned there.
But I think one of the things to pull out from the discussion around critical minerals was a lot of the same challenges, the core, like how do you build in a data framework that can be managed over the life cycle of a mine. That same problem exists within other sectors, whether it's pipelines, whether it's forests, whether it's farms. How do you ensure you get high quality data over the entire life cycle and ensure that the marginal cost of additional data doesn't undermine the entire practice as a whole? So we do see these interesting shared problems across industry, but certainly the mining opportunity for Canada exists as a very clear opportunity for Canada. Emily, I see you got your hand up.
Obviously, I completely agree with Robert on the mining point. I think it's good that it has its own lane because it is so pivotal. Just a couple thoughts, I suppose. One is on the forestry and decarbonization point. Just from having worked with folks who work in forestry previously, it may be helpful as well to not forget that there are other ecosystems that also sequester a great deal of carbon and have a big impact in terms of carbon sequestration. Sometimes the forestry lens gets really focused on trees and tree planting. What we saw in some jurisdictions like New Zealand is high quality intact grasslands being planted with monoculture trees for people to try to get their maximum dollar, when in fact grasslands and wetlands are some of the best carbon sequestration we've got. So just a flag in terms of thinking about that. And I'll put a plug in. I work in mining for the BC government, but I'll put a plug in for the alternative energy folks. I know in BC, I don't know what other provinces are doing in this space, but I know that we are really starting to think about in that area, what does it actually take for alternative energy sectors to be sectors? So that you're thinking about how do you encourage, incentivize, and make clear both regulatory processes, but also data. Where are the resources? Where does it make sense to invest in them? To date, these have been very one-off exercises. So things like geothermal in the Northeast, where you have people having to kind of bend the rules in order to clear that and go through, because those rules weren't designed with those different resources in mind. And I know that there's a big dearth of information in terms of that baseline, like where is the resource, and how can we incentivize people to go develop those resources. The big focus we have right now is the province of BC is off-grid. And so decarbonizing off-grid communities, I believe there's about 45 that they're trying to work on for that. And the big issue there is diesel and trying to find alternative energy solutions for those off-grid communities. So just something to think about under the broad spectrum of decarbonization, just because it's in its infancy stages. So we don't think of them as industries in the same way that we do others, but it's worthwhile to think about what is it needed in order for those to be developed.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Emily, and it harks back to, I think, a comment that Minister Wilkinson made around how long it takes to develop a mine site, from initial identification all the way through permitting, regulation, the social license to operate, putting all those infrastructure development pieces together. In many ways, same problem in alternative energy as well, where you've got large deployments of infrastructure and multiple stakeholder groups that you need to engage with and consult with. So similar problems there. And it would be interesting. Obviously, there are various technologies that are touted as being able to change the world around permitting and regulation, digital plays a large role in that. I'm just wondering from a government perspective, if any of those popped on your radar in terms of the work that you undertake within the mining sector.
We try not to be too married to any one technology or approach. We usually leave a lot of that in the hands of industry in terms of, here are your constraints, here's what you can't do. And then a lot of that innovation occurs, at the industry level. I will say, though, that groups who are pushing for certain key technologies are Indigenous people, Indigenous governments specifically. So there are nations that have perspectives on this in terms of what is a desirable or tech or interest to be utilizing in mining operations, and sometimes they'll speak to proponents directly about those interests, and that can be an opportunity for a collaborative approach to how people extract minerals. But in terms of BC, province of BC, we absolutely are, we're supportive of innovation. I think that there is, the question for us is how do we support industry in innovating a lot of the time.
That's great. Just as you were talking and thinking about how technology can spill over from one industry to the other, obviously anything we do in decarbonization potentially has spillover effects, in other jurisdictions. And Bill raised this point around, the creation of data, and it raised in my mind, Chris and Matt, again from Earth Daily, some of the work that you guys have been doing whilst you were doing it on ag and water, particularly. Like, it was really insurance companies as well who were interested in the production of data, and provides potentially a commercialization pathway for that data. So I'm kind of interested in understanding from the group if there's other areas where you think, whilst decarbonization matures, and in some cases there's a very easy business case to be built. In others, actually the collection of the data in and around decarbonization presents opportunities in other fields. I wonder if there's other examples that people on the call could perhaps describe as potentially nearer term commercialization opportunities whilst on the decarb track. Yeah, Emily, go again.
I'll throw out there, just off top of my head, is that mining data and the way that you go and approach mining data can be huge implications for geothermal, because they both involve drilling into the ground and information that comes out of the ground. So that is a one that can potentially be a knock-on.
Nice. Anyone else can offer examples?
Emily, since you opened that door, I'm not sure if you can expand on the province's work on the mining trust ecosystem and whether there's applications for that in other sectors, similar to what you're describing with, geothermal.
I would say that, that's one project of several, but there are foundational data challenges, I think, are something that still needs to be addressed in order to feed that, and ensure that the ways that information is shared, whether that's the Mines Digital Trust or other things, that you have information and verified credentials that you can share effectively. I'm not an expert on that particular file, so I can't speak to it, but I do know that it has the same challenges that a lot of our different areas have in terms of data availability, data format, data digitization and digitalization, and data transformation. Because when you are feeding information into any system, what you get is only as good as what you put in. And so a lot of the thinking around, how do we share out information? Eventually you hit this point where you go, oh, shoot, how good is our information? Where is our information? How do we get information to be in a place where they can be consumed and utilized? So I would say it's almost like you get to a certain point where there's something exciting and you're like, oh, this is great. And then you go, wait, hang on, 5 steps back. I need to actually get the information in there so that that can be utilized and shared out in a way that's appropriate. So I'd say that the one thing to really contemplate is what format is data in, who holds that data, and how do you get that information to be in a digital space in a format that can be utilized by that and other applications. And as soon as you do that, the impacts are exponential, but it takes time and resources and effort to get there.
Thanks. Sounds a lot like the challenges that our friends on the Earth Data Store had on just normalizing data and getting ontology set up in the first place on a whole host of things. So, okay. Sorry, Ian, I didn't mean to interrupt there. You were on a flow of questions.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in where the spillover benefits of digital decarbonization can actually materialize in meaningful commercial traction for companies as well. And I'm actually circling back to some of Metaspectral's work, putting payloads on the ISS is, to be able to monetize that multiple times would be a nice thing, presumably. So other than monitoring, emissions at a high level, what other use cases perhaps are bubbling in the back of your head in terms of utilizing that data?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, by the way, my name's pronounced Miguel. It's without a U. But yeah, for the project, we are looking at detecting plastics in oceans, where there's a lot of issues, where there's congregated areas that have a lot of plastics, and it's affecting a lot of biodiversity. So we're looking at that, where you can't actually detect with ground sensors because it's in the ocean. And so that is one part we're looking at. And the other is actually quantifying the amount of fuel, so to speak, that would be present in forestries, where in summer and hot seasons, which could lead to wildfire. So actually quantifying the amount of fuel indirectly by measuring the chlorophyll, which is the greenery and the dryness of the wood. So that's where we're really looking at, Ian, and we're doing it through spectral analysis.
Miguel, just in terms of your customer for that, obviously at a landscape level, government are the obvious kind of candidates for that. Is that correct? Or government, at various different levels? Yeah, no,
we're also putting a plan together to tackle it in a hierarchical way. So the satellites are providing kind of like a God's eye view of what's going on, and then our plan is to do drones providing targeted analysis in a given area, and then if there's a need, going deeper into maybe field deployed robots to do very precise measurements. So we're putting a hierarchical approach going forward. But yeah, things are still very much in play when nothing's really finalized. But one really good conversation we had last week was we met in Kelowna one of the largest fruit growers, picker and packer, and they have a lot of manual labor, that's imported labor, just temporary workers coming in to do a lot of work in the farms. And I think that's also something that could benefit from our technology stack, and we are also looking into that too.
Interesting. So I'm just noting these down like crazy. Thank you for offering those up and sharing that with us.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, I think and I can see Janice was commenting on this as well. This interesting balance between maintaining and maximizing carbon, whether it's in forestry or in grasslands, and then the chance of wildfire associated with that. And so there's we actually talked about that with Mosaic and Kofi earlier in at the tail end of last week around actually making real decision making over long periods of time where you do have these risks and these shocks, and how do you actually do that and then deploy and manage that on the ground. And that does appear to be an environment where you have to have multiple technologies contributing to that problem set over long periods of time, but also have the tools for precision management as well. Just too many notifications popping up on my screen. Janice, was there anything further that you wanted to add? I know you're just pinging some stuff about wildfires into the chat and integrated risk management.
Yeah, and that was just because I had seen some articles recently around that, right? We don't often talk about that in these forestry environments. You can, or in particular, how they can go up in smoke, and your asset or the value of whatever this digitally trading market that we're trying to get going through verification processes, things like digital trust. Well, the underlying asset might disappear, and that's something to think about. But it's so, that brought to light in terms of when we talk about a region, like Emily, I'm thinking about, what you're dealing with as governments across areas, and Indigenous groups as well are covering big areas and trying to help with the permitting and approvals of projects from all different industries. So how do we create visibility around that in terms of making those decisions around the trade-offs? It seems to be there, not only on the quantitative, but on the qualitative side. So, I just echo what you're saying. And when we come from the mining industry, maybe we don't have the empathy that there's other industries or other projects that are trying to get started and maybe accelerating faster than how we're moving in terms of our potential to meet the bigger goals, or the goals at all scales, from government to community down to corporate. And how do we make that visible? So I'm very curious about how we go forward in digital. How can it help the permitting stream to enable all of this stuff? Yeah.
100%. I hear you there. And I'd add just that nations tend to have a very holistic view of the land. It's not about, yes, mining is one thing and forestry is another. And then the land is the land is often the nature of the conversation that you're having. But our information streams are often so siloed that it causes real challenges, because, if you think about a permitting individual, even for one resource, other resource past uses could have an implication for what the requirements need to be for a given area. And right now, I can tell you a lot of that information, and it is inherently interagency and reaching out, it's done manually. It's done by, email requests for information back. It's done in Excel spreadsheets. It's done in picking up the phone because you know the right person to call. That is obviously not the most efficient way. And what if that person that you knew was the right person to call moves on, and then you have no contact anymore? So I would just echo that integration of information between industries, even at I think spatially is huge. Like, where are the overlapping interests, tenures, obligations, et cetera. And then, the more detailed info also. It's a big challenge, and there's definitely, we could all be more responsive to each other than we are now. But because that information is so siloed, we have challenges with that.
Yeah. In many ways, we see a lot of the same challenges in health. Around verification, around consent for data, around the monetization of data itself, around who actually owns the problem, whether it's provinces, federal governments, or industry, and how do we contribute to that? So again, I see lots of parallels across our portfolio, and again speaks to the interdisciplinary activities that we like to fund and support. And coming back to Chris's comments around trying to find those use cases that may not be straight in the bullseye in terms of perhaps what a program narrative is around, but is really important in the added value associated with the technology that's being developed. And so trying to find those kinds of projects that marry a lot of those various pieces together, having a project where we have forestry and mining, where there may be oil and gas rights, where there may be indigenous groups, where there's a technology stack that can meaningfully make valuable interventions for multiple groups and add value over long periods of time, is really important to us. Just on that third pillar that we had in that slide that Bill showed you on trade and transport is a really great example of that, where you have obviously the port, you have the rail links and the road links that come into there. You've got obviously the marine links. They're obviously an interface between land and sea. So there's coastal groups and environmental stewardship. A really interesting environment for that kind of integrated both resource planning, risk management, and environmental stewardship to come together. Trying to find those kinds of projects is an interesting journey for us, because obviously, as Emily said, you very often find very siloed projects, and actually trying to bring these things together is something that we hope to do. So Bill, I see we're coming up to the top of the hour. I was going to hand it back to you at this point, but want to thank everyone for your engagement in today's call.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Ian. I think that was some great and very rich comments there. I think, come away pretty inspired that there's a real sense that we can maybe stitch together some different sort of siloed activities or different sectors and try to make a difference in this next phase. This is, again, just the beginning, not the end of the conversation. We are continuing to look for input towards what we should do as part of our strategy for this next phase, but all the way through, I think, in the execution of that. We'll follow up with some information from the session, the recording, the presentation, and I'd invite you, if you have further ideas or suggestions of things that we should be doing, in particular, if you know some industry sort of drivers that people might be interested in investing in, certainly let us know how we can continue to evolve our thinking on this as we get closer to putting a strategy together. So thanks again for spending the first part of your afternoon, or maybe the last part of your afternoon if you're out in the East Coast, and hope everyone has a great day. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.